Okay.
And
Um,
Rabbi, Beilah Chanukah, Gonna Chodesh.
thank you to you as well. Okay, we can begin,
Please.
please. Wow. Okay. Yes. Do you have Marmakomos or not?
I don't know if Sheila sent it out.
I sent it to her pretty late, but so I don't know if she was.
She might have left a
Um,
little early today. Do you want to? Is there a way? I'm thinking I could post it. I don't know how to do all that. I'm not as tech savvy.
no.
Um, Let me see it. Ezra, you don't know how to post it. Let me see who's on this call that could help us.
You know what? I'll do it the old fashioned. I'll just try to.
Okay.
We'll we'll
Sorry,
try to.
she might have left a little early today.
No, 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 no. It's not her fault. I really was out, and by the time I sent it was a little late. So it's definitely not.
Okay.
You know, it's
It's like an Erev Yontif, so maybe she might have left a little early.
right, right, understandably. Okay, so we'll try to make it clear. I'll try to quote the parts that are relevant anyway. Okay, so yeah, what I'd like to speak a little bit about is um, the status of Alanisim that we seem to say ubiquitously, right, in Tefillah and in Birchas Hamazon during the 8 days of Hanukkah. We say Alanisim. We also say it on a different version of it, but different story on Purim. So I'd like to talk about the relationship between the Alanisim of the Tefillah and Alanisim of Birchas Hamazon. Okay, so yeah, so the Gemara. Let's start with the Gemara, and I'm sorry you don't have Gemara Makomos, but I'll try to make it as clear as we can. The Gemara on Daf Chav Dalid Amud Aleph in Masachet Shabbos raises the question whether or not you insert Alanisim to Birchas Hamazon or not. So the Gemara says, Iboilahu. The Gemara has a question. Mahu
What
lahazkir
Masechta is this, Rabbi?
Shabbos.
Okay, and what's the
Oh,
reason
come
you
on,
wouldn't?
Jacob Gold.
What's that?
You go on mute. What's the reason you wouldn't do it in Birchas Hamazon?
Well, so yeah, so let's discuss. I'm going to
Okay.
read the question of the Gemara and then we'll follow up. So the Gemara says, Iboilahu. Iboilahu means the Gemara is asking a question. Should you make reference to Hanukkah in Birchas Hamazon or not? Okay. So the Gemara says, on the one hand, Kibin de Midrabanan who lo mid Karinan. The whole Hanukkah is a holiday that is Drabanan. It's a rabbinic obligation. So unlike like what do we mention in Birkas Hamazon? Shabbos, of course, Ritzei, on Yom Tov, of course, Yalav Yavo, on Rosh Chodesh. Today was also Rosh Chodesh. Tomorrow is also Rosh Chodesh, right? So then we have Yalav Yavo, but these all are connected to biblical festivals, and therefore, that obviously gives it extra stature. So maybe a haskara b'berachas hamazon requires a doraisa status, and this doesn't have that. So then lo mid karinan, we will not mention it. Odilma mishum persume nisa mad karinan, or shall we say that even though it's not technically a biblical obligation, what's unique about about the whole holiday of Hanukkah and Purim by extension is that the focus is on Pirsume Nisa, on promoting the Rabbanu Shalom's special hashgacha, is the divine providence, which also produces miracles, when we need it. So Pirsume Nisa is something that should be mentioned even in the Birchas Hamazon. That's the Gemara's suffix. The Gemara has a doubt about that. So what's fascinating is that if you just look at the Gemara alone, the conclusion, the Gemara says, Omar Rava, Omar Rav Skora, Omar Rav Huna, Eino Mazkir. You don't mention Alanisim. There's no insertion in the Birchas Hamazon of Hanukkah. Then the Gemara goes on and says, however, the imba lahazkir, if he wants to or he comes to, make reference to it, mazkir bahoda. So he should insert al anisim in hoda, meaning the benching. That means right after no delacha. Right, everybody's familiar with the benching. It starts. The first bracha is Hazana Salam Kolob Tebal B'chein B'chesed of Rachamim, right? And then the next one is No Delecha Hashem Elokeinu Al Shinchalta Lavosenu Eretz Chemda Tova Urakava Al Shot Tzanu Eretz Mitzrayim, and so on. It refers to it's Thanksgiving for Eretz Yisrael, for the Bris Milah, and so on and so forth, for Yitzias Mitzrayim. So that is a no delacha. Then comes, the alakol anachnu modim lach, right? The other sections of the Berachos Hamazon. Now we know that, in theory, depending on the theme of what it is that we're inserting, you would put it in different places. So, for example, Yalav Yavo and Ritzei are inserted in the benching, not at Hoda'ah, right after No Delacha, but later, right in before we get to the later parts, Rachem and so on. So what the Gemara says is very remarkable. The Gemara says in Bola Haskir, which itself is strange. It sounds like it's up to him if he insists on making reference to Hanukkah in the Berachos Hamazon, right? Then Mazkir Bahoda. Where should he put it if he wants to put it somewhere? After No Delacha, which is what we do. Rav Huna bar Rabbi Yehuda ikalabe Rava savar la'adkure bibone Yerushalayim. So Rav Huna bar Rabbi Yehuda basically thought that instead of mentioning it after No Delacha, you should mention it before Bone Yerushalayim, just like we integrated there in terms of Ritzei or Yalav Yavo, etc.
So have we at this point established that we should be saying it? Just a question where?
So that's
what makes it different than Yalav Yavo or denoting Ritzei? Granted, they are perhaps derisive versus.
Well, that's the Gemara's suffix. The Gemara's two sides.
Borderline case.
Right. So the Gemara's two sides are it's only drabanan, therefore you shouldn't have to bother, or it's pursume Isa and you should be obligated. So the Gemara seems to that. The point I want to make is that if you look, this is the only Gemara that discusses this question. The Gemara's initial answer is, I'm sorry we don't have the text in front of you, but is Amar Avuna Eino Mazkir, meaning you don't have to mention it. But then the Gemara immediately says, in Bala Hazkir, however, if he wants to, or if he, insists on mentioning it, so now there's a second argument, and that is where do you put it? After No Delacha?
Is the Gemara equally bothered about the Amida?
Oh, so I want to get to that in a second. It's a great question. So we're going to you'll see in a second what the Gemara says and what Rashi says. That's part of what I want to discuss. The Gemara says, Savar Kuri Bian Bodi Yerushalayim. Then the Gemara says, Omer Lahu Rav Sheshes Kitzvila. Ma Tvila Behoda'a Af Birkas Hamazon Behoda'a. The Gemara says,
Rabbi, is there any question about saying it in Shemona Esrei? There's only a question about benching.
Yeah, that's what Andy just asked. So
sorry.
No, 100%. That's exactly what we're getting to. So the Gemara says. So let me tell you what it says, and then I'll flesh out the implication a little bit. And that is what it says is the Gemara only brings in tefillah to prove where you insert. In the Birchas Hamazon, where do you put the Al Anisim? Do you put it after No Delacha or before Bone Yerushalayim? In other words, do you treat it as something different than Ritzei and Yalav Yavo, or something similar? So then the Gemara says, well, in Tefillah, we put it in Hoda'ah. Again, now Tefillah is broken up into different components, as we know, right? So there is avos, gvuros, and so on. You have all the, the beginning part, and then you have the we call that usually shevach. Then comes bakasha, That's where you have all the requests. Atachone lodam das, uvnei Yerushalayim, slach lanu, Malkinu, and so on, Hashiva, Shavtenu, Kavarishona. And then you have in the last part, starting from Modim, you have Hoda'ah, right? That's the structure that's the triple structure of Shemon Esrei. The Rambam actually, very interestingly, in the beginning of Hilchos Tefillah, even though he thinks that this structure is Doraisa, this idea that there are three components in Shemon Esrei, that there is, Shevach, Bakasha, Hoda'ah. He says, even though in his opinion, the amount of tefillos is Rabbanan, the text of the tefillos, is Rabbanan, the times of the tefillos is Rabbanan. But there are two things that are Doraisa about tefillah, according to the Rambam. One is the obligation that you engage in tefillah every single day. That's a big chiddush of the Rambam, but that's Minat Torah. And the other is that there's a triple formula for tefillah, and that is that there's Shevach, Bakasha, Hodah. Anyways, Hodah begins at Modim. So when do we put
Yovo would not be part of Hodor in Shemon Esrei? It's on the border.
Say that again?
Yalav Yovo is on the border.
It's well, Yalav Yovo is really in
Amida. It's on the border.
It's Ritzei, so it's not Hoda'ah. It's
on the border, though.
It's Me'ina Ma'ora. It's Kedushas Hayom, really. So what they're talking about in terms of Hoda'ah would be like, which is what we do for Al Anisim, is that we say it after Modim. In fact, there are two girsos. I don't know what they do in the Fifth Avenue Synagogue, but is it Al Anisim ve'ala Porkan ve'la or ve'al Anisim? So the idea of, if in many Sidurim you have the Vav in parentheses, and it's a big argument, because the theme of Al Anisim is Hoda'ah, and therefore saying the Vav Achibur, connecting it. The reason we insert it there is because it's Hoda'ah. So one way of integrating it is to say Ve'al Anisim Kime'alam Kivinu Lach Ve'al Anisim Ve'al Pork. And if you say Al Anisim, that's also fine. But the point is that's where it is. So what's fascinating about this Gemara is...
I'm sorry, the question is, do you put a Vav in or not? Is that the question?
In Tefillah, yeah.
Yeah, Ezra, what do we do? We don't?
The original Sidurim we had in the shul, Tikkun Meir, if anybody remembers that besides me, had the Vav in. Those Sidurim, to be perfectly honest, fell apart over a 25 or 30-year period. We didn't rebind them. They were out of print. And the Siddur we basically use now has the Vav in parenthesis.
Interesting. Okay, thanks.
Letting you know.
Thank you.
Tikkun Meir, it brings back, it's like a blast from the past.
I thought it was a great Siddur.
It was.
I have one at home. Use it all the time.
Is that the blue one? Is that the little blue one, Ezra?
Dinosaur. Pardon me?
Is that the little blue one?
No, it's actually not so little. We had them in light blue and dark blue. Mr. Finkelstein bought 100 in 1958.
All right, you're showing to me there.
That's what we had.
Anyways,
I showed it to you once.
So the Vav issue is to try to figure out how integrated it is with with the modem itself. So what's fascinating about this Gemara is that the Gemara is asking about Birchas Hamazon. Just to sum up again, because you don't have it in front of you, the Gemara wants to know whether or not you should say Al Anisim and Birchas Hamazon at all. Initially, the Gemara says no. Okay, but then the Gemara continues. It says, again, the language is V'im ba lahaskir, if he insists. I don't know. I'm using the word insist. If he does integrate it as if it's a choice, right? So then there's a second argument. Does he put it, where normally we'd put Ritzei and Yalav Yavo, or right after No Delacha, in the section of Hodah. And then the third point of the Gemara is the Gemara says, well, it's got to be the Hodah because that's what it is in Tefillah. So a number of you asked, like, what does the Gemara think? Is it when the Gemara is mistapek, whether or not in Birchas Hamazon you will say Al Anisim, like what at that point is its view about Shemon Esrei, about Tefillah? So the Gemara doesn't say this explicitly, but by bringing a proof where you insert Al Anisim in Tefillah, right, as the paradigm for Birchas Hamazon, it would appear that we have greater comfort, meaning that there's an assumption that we do say Al Anisim in Tefillah. And the question is, why? Either way, it would appear from this Gemara that it's more obvious to say Al Anisim in Tefillah than it is in Birchas Hamazon at minimum. It's also, just in light of this Gemara, very strange, because all of us have the practice to say Al Anisim in benching. If you look it up in the, again, we were just, talking about the different Sidurim and whether you should say Ve'al Anisim or Al Anisim, right? But in every Siddur, we have the insertion of Al Anisim in Birchas Hamazon, and in the Shulchan Aruch, it's just mentioned, as a davar pashut that this is something that we say. If you look, I was going to say, look, but you don't have it. Only I have it. The tour, I'll just read from the tour. In Orach Chaim, in Siman Tuf Pei, Tuf Reish Pei base says Kol Ches Yemei Chanukah Mazkir Shel Chanukah. On the 8th days of Chanukah, we mention Chanukah, Perush, Al Anisim, B'Tfila uBeBirchas Hamazon, V'Omro B'Tfila BeBirchas Modim, uBeBirchas Hamazon BeBirchas Haaretz. Then the tour adds, and this is one of the things we're going to discuss, V'Im Lo Omro Ein Makzirinoso. If you don't say it, you don't have to repeat the Shmona Esrei. However, it sounds like the tour is saying that there's an obligation to say Al Anisim in Birchas Hamazon, right? Even though the Gemara seems to conclude, no, it's almost like it's voluntary, and that doesn't appear in the, in the tour, in the Shulchan Aruch, even the Rambam, mostly seems to equate them. So that is strange. It's just a strange phenomenon that the Gemara gives a certain impression and the Balei Halacha mostly ignored it. But of course, in the Gemara itself, it's strange, meaning, what do you mean imba? If it's not appropriate, if there's no obligation to say Al Anisim, isn't it a hefsek? You can't just make insertions in the middle of Birchas Hamazon, right? It's Birchas Hamazon, like Tefillah, as we discussed, is a structure, meaning the Chachamim have to be metakein, to add to that structure. Otherwise, Kalamosif Gorea, it's a hefsek. It undercuts the tight composition, or constitution of Birchas Hamazon. So what does it mean when we say V'Im Ba Lahazkir Mazkir Behodah? It's just a strange phenomenon. So
isn't it
even if you were to leave it at like that, it's strange. And then it became even stranger because in the halacha, it became nifsak, that it's the equivalent of tefillah. But I'm going to go a step further and tell you that there is a shita, the Ravya, who goes even a big giant step further than that, and who says that when it comes to Birchas Hamazon, if you omit Al Anisim, you have to be choser, not in tefillah, perhaps, but only in Birchas Hamazon.
So Birchas Hamazon is more important. It's reversed.
Yeah, the
we
reverse.
said earlier that the Birchas Hamazon was a question, tefillah was automatic.
Right.
So I would have assumed the opposite.
Exactly. So that's a big problem. I'm going to read you the line of the Ravya. Just one second. I'm going to read you the Ravya as it's quoted. It's a Ravya on the end of Hanukkah. But I'll read it to you a little bit from the Bach, and I'll get back to what the Bach says about it later. But the Bach really likes this Ravya. V'nira l'Ravya, af al gav demasik hachadaz karas Hanukkah reshusi b'Birchas Hamazon. Even though the Gemara seems to say that whether you say Al Anisim in Birchas Hamazon is only a reshus, meaning it's up to you, which itself is strange, right? Miu kivin de nohu kula alma lahaskir, since the Klal Yisrael kind of decided they wanted to do this badly, and they did it. The gam birech amanas lahaskir, and when he started his benching, his intention was, to include Al Anisim. Shavia aleha kova. So that turns it into a chova. Wow, what a phenomenon, right? And therefore, v'chozer, if he omits it at that point, he has to repeat the whole Birchas Hamazon. The Raya, listen to the proof. Mid pasak Bal Halachas Gedolos, is a famous psak of the Bal Halachas Gedolos. The Afil Man Damar Tfilas Arvis Rishus v'chule. What does he mean? There's a debate in the Gemara and Brachos, the fourth parak, whether or not we know that Shachris and Mincha are obligatory, correct? But Arvis, Mariv, is called, it's the Gemara has a debate whether it's a Tfilas Chova or Tfilas Rishus. And Lahalacha, we paskin that it's a Tfilas Arvis is Rishus, meaning it's up to you. You don't have to daven. Mariv. However, the Gemara said, now, so the Bali Tosas in Brachos say, when the Gemara says Tfilas Arvis Rishus, they don't really mean it. They mean it's not as much of a chiyuv, it's a relative statement. It's not as much of a chiyuv as Shachris and Mincha, but it is a chiyuv. What are they trying to explain? They're trying to explain why it is, for example, that if you forget, the Gemara says that if you forget Yalav Yavo and Mariv, let's say it's Yom Tov or Rosh Chodesh. So if you forget Yalav Yavo and Mariv, you don't have to repeat the Shemon Esrei. The Gemara says because Ein Mekadshin is a Chodesh Balayla, because there's no Kiddush HaChodesh at night. So the Bali Tosas and others ask, what do you mean? Why not just say because Tfilas Arvis is Rishus? It's a voluntary tefillah. So if you make a mistake and you omit Yalav Yavo, either way you wouldn't repeat because you only did it on a voluntary level as well. So the Bali Tosas answer to that question is the Gemara didn't mean that it's a Rishus, that it's up to you. The Gemara meant that it's not a chiyuv gamur in the same way relative to Shachris. And Mincha, it's less of an obligation, but it's still obligatory. However, the Bahag and the Rambam and many of the Chachmei Sfarad take a different view. They came up with a very fascinating idea, and that is they said, Kivan de Kiblu Aleha, Shavya Kechova. Since Klal Yisrael decided to accept upon themselves Arvis, so they turned it into a chiyuv. And since they turned it into a chiyuv, that's why, if not for the fact that Ein Mekadshin is a Chodesh Balayla, you would, in fact, have to repeat the Shemon Esrei. Or another phenomenon, let's say you forget, to daven, let's say you daven Mariv on Friday night, and you forget to mention that it's Shabbos. So you have to repeat that Shemon Esrei. Or, for example, let's say you forgot to daven Mariv, right? So there's a principle called Tfilas Tashlumin, which means that you double up the very next opportunity. You take 2 Shemon Esreis. So if you forget Mariv, if you forget Shachris, you say 2 Minchas. If you forget Mincha, you say 2 Marivs. If you forget Mariv, you say 2 Shachrises. So that's one of the things that bothered the Rishonim. They said, why, if you forget Mariv, do you have to say 2 Shachrises? After all, Tfilas Arvis is Rishus. So Bali Tosa said, yeah, because it isn't really a Rishus. The Bahag said, no, Klal Yisrael has the ability sometimes, that we have to figure this out, Kivan de Kiblu Aleha Shavya Kechova. They accepted it. Now, so that's what the Ravya is using as a model for this idea that Birchas Hamazon, Al Anisim, the Gemara says that at best it's voluntary. So how did it go from voluntary to, if you leave it out, you have to repeat? So the Ravya says, because Klal Yisrael accepted it, Kivan de Kiblu Aleha Shavya Kechov. That's a very remarkable idea. It's not, is it a good comparison?
Oh, we have
Not really.
we have
Because at least Tfilas Arvis, the Gemara says, is patterned after, they used to when the Karbanos, when they didn't have time to burn all the emurim of the Karbanos, the Evarim and the Pedarim and whatever it was, so they would leave it on the Mizbeach at night. Even though normal Karbanos were not brought at night, but the remnant of the emurim that weren't burnt were put on the mizbeach, and they were able to, burn them at nighttime. So that's why the Gemara says that, there's something called tefillas arvis. It's like Evarim upedarim. It's patterned that, like we say, the tefillas are connected karbanos or connected avos. So connected avos, that's Yaakov Avinu, who also, each one of the avos, according to our history, daven. So we take that further and say each one pioneered, one of the three tefillos. And we also have, karbanos, that are the paradigm of tefillah. We have two tmidim, tamid shel, boker, and tamid shel bein arbayim. That's keneged shachris and mincha. And then the varim and the pedarim that were, that they continued to burn at nighttime is the pattern of mar. So arvis is different than shachris and mincha, maybe, but not so different. Right. So the Gemara says that, kiva de kiblu, shavya, kechov. However, did that apply? You can't just apply it to anything. There's an interesting discussion in the some of the poskim about Sfiras HaOmer for women. Most Rishonim are the opinion that Sfiras HaOmer is a male obligation, not a women obligation, because it's a mitzvah shazman grama. Ramban actually in Masachet Kiddushin disagrees. He has a very strange view that in the end of the first parak of Kiddushin, that Sfiras HaOmer is not a mitzvah seishas mangrom. Okay, but most people think that it is. However, says the Magen Avram, says that women took it upon themselves, to say Sfiras HaOmer, and as a result, it became obligatory for them, based on this idea of the Bahag with regard to Tfilas Arvis, and this idea of the Ravya with regard to Alanisim on Chanukah for Birchas Hamazon. So you have this very interesting phenomenon that on the one hand, the Gemara, thought that, the likelihood that Tefillah, has Alanisim is greater than that of Birchas Hamazon. And not only that, but the simple reading of the Gemara is that the Gemara's conclusion is that there is no obligation to insert whatsoever, right? At the same time, what happened afterwards was, in the next lines of the Gemara, there became a voluntary imba, there became a voluntary insertion of Alanisim without any question about interruptions, meaning hefsek, etc. The Gemara seems that it has to, contend with that problem. And then in the halacha, they kind of equated the two, even though it doesn't seem that way. It seems like Birchas Hamazon would be inferior. And then in the world of the Ravya, and the Bahag embraces that. I'm sorry, the Bahag. The Bach and others embrace that Ravya. It's not, we don't accept it lahalacha, in mainstream psak, but there are enough poskim who discuss it and accept it, including the Bach, that it turns out that this, underdog Alanisim, right, ends up being more indispensable than the Alanisim of Tefillah.
But the part
So
where
we need to explain why that is, and that's what I want to try to do a little more. But before I do that,
the part whereby minig is established in Israel and becomes, is not, and this is not the only solitary, so to speak, case of this nature. And then, once it's been established for X period of time, you have Alter Freshman at Zebra, you have all kinds of issues which make it very difficult to undo it. We even have on the negative side, what's it called again, the second day Yontif, which, what came because of a suffix of the calendar, which we now know what the end, but we don't change it. So I don't know that that's so unique. Well,
it is unique. I mean, because this isn't B'Torah's minhag. This is B'Torah's, the idea that minhag Yisrael, Torah, that's a whole massive, as you can imagine, topic. But that's B'Torah's minhag, is a chiyuv neder, or things of that sort. And it remains as a minhag. Like, for example, the Gemara has a discussion, mevarchen ala minhag, ein mevarchen ala minhag. I mean, you're quite right. There are minhagim that, were adopted and then they became, integrated into the world of Torah and halacha. But this phrase, kivan de kiblu ale shavya kechova, implies that it's not just b'toras minhag, but that somehow, this, the stock of this, halacha, went from being, not an obligation to something that is practiced to something that, because it was so widely embraced, became an obligatory halacha, right? Not just, I mean, if you're choser and benching for it, that's a big statement. Again, we don't paskin that you're choser and benching. That's just the view of the Rav Yah. But the fact that there is such a view and that other poskim, weighed it and in some cases accepted it is a phenomenon. So this is a little bit more. Just as
so you're not closing for benching. What about for tefillah? You are, right? Or you're not?
What?
If you leave Al Anisim out in davening,
everybody, pretty much everybody agrees that you are not choser.
You're not choser, but Yalav Yavo you are, right?
Yes. Ritzeh, Shabbos, Yalav Yavo, you certainly are. But
so why would Yalav Yavo have greater rate than Hanukkah? Because it's more tutter?
No, because Yalav Yavo is reflects Kedushas Hayom.
Right.
Me'ein ha'ma'ora, it's a Kedushas Hayom. So the point is that the Shmoneh Esrei of a Yom Tov, of a Moed, or even of a Rosh Chodesh, defines that Shmoneh Esrei.
And whatever you do by Hanukkah, you do by Purim. I don't know if the Gemara doesn't distinguish, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a discussion whether or not we could distinguish between them and in which direction. But the general psak is that Al Anisim is not ma'akev, either in Tefillah or in Birchas Hamazon, not for Hanukkah, not for Purim. But there are those who make distinctions.
Okay.
For example, we'll see. I mean, in this Rav Yah, maybe even a distinction, and actually in the direction of Hanukkah. This is particularly, I would add, striking because it's not so clear. I mean, this phenomenon that I'm describing, which is that somehow the assumption was that, even if Al Anisim is said in Tefillah, it's not necessarily said in Birchas Hamazon. A. B, that the most transparent reading of the Gemara is that it's not, or it's certainly not obligatory, and then somehow it became accepted that it was done, and then in some cases, in some corners of the halachic world, that even that it was ma'akev. This is a very interesting phenomenon, but it's particularly interesting in light of another question, and that is there an obligation to have a seuda on Hanukkah? Right. So obviously, the more
we're not. You mean hamotzi, not donuts? Is there?
Are you obligated to eat bread? And have that kind of a meal. Though, for example, there's obligation to eat a Suda on Shabbos, Oneg Shabbos, and on Yom Tov.
And Rosh Chodesh, there's an Indian also, right?
Well, Rosh Chodesh, there's no obligation to eat bread, which is why, by the way, the Yalav Yavo on a typical Rosh Chodesh is not Ma'akev.
If you would explain...
Yalav Yavo is Ma'akev on Rosh Chodesh and Tefillah, but it's not Ma'akev Birchas Hamazon. The only question is, let's say you have Shabbos Rosh Chodesh. So that is a massive debate among the Rishonim. There are those who say, the Meiri and others, and some Achronim say this, that since it's an obligatory meal because of Shabbos, so then even if you leave out the insertion of Yalav Yoda, which comes from Rosh Chodesh, you would have to repeat as well, because it's an obligatory meal. Therefore, you have to, make sure that you bench, perfectly or close to perfectly.
If somehow
however, the majority view in the halacha is that on Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, if you omit Yalav Yavo, as long as you say Ritzei, that you're okay, that you don't have to repeat. So actually, but of course for Shemon Esrei, you do have to repeat Rosh Chodesh.
If you would equate the value proposition, so to speak, of Purim and Hanukkah together,
Yeah.
one could take the position that there should not have to be a Suda on Hanukkah, because by Purim, it had to be specifically mandated as one of the three things or so that one has to do on Purim is to have a
Right,
Suda.
so we'll talk about that. So let's talk for a minute about that question. Is there a Chiv Suda? So before we get to even...
Yeah, Rabbi, I'm sorry, one question. So if there was a Chiyuv Suda on Hanukkah, how would that work? It would be one meal a day, meaning would it be 3 meals a day?
That's a great question.
Is it a meal at night, a meal during the day? Like, I don't understand.
That's a great question. I'm not sure. It for sure would be at least one meal a day.
Right.
Just like you light once a day, right? So it would for sure be one meal a day.
Right. But you have to light at night. That's where I'm going. Like you light at night. You can't light during the day, right? You're not Yotze if you light during the day, are you?
Correct. But presumably the meal could be either night or day. I would assume.
It shouldn't make a difference. Okay.
I'm not sure. We're not sure. Who even holds that there is such thing? We'll see in a moment. So before we get to that, I want to read you Rashi. So Rashi, like the Balei Tosfos, like our diuk in the Gemara, but for a different reason, was wondering. Remember, you all jumped in to say, like, what about Tefillah? What's the story with Tefillah? Why are we more certain about Tefillah than Berachos Hamazon? Right? So actually, Rashi jumped in. So I'm going to read you what Rashi says. Rashi says on the when the Gemara says, "Do you say Al Anisim in Birchos Hamazon?" So Rashi says, "B'tfila pshitalon." When it comes to tefillah, it's obvious that you are going to say Al Anisim. Shaharei lahal v'hodah nikba'u kedarmina la'el. So what does that mean? What do you mean? Since the Gemara says that for Halal and Hodah, they established Chanukah, 8 days of Halal, the Hodah, so it's obvious that you have to say Al Anisim in Tefillah. What does that mean? So I think it means a couple of things, but before we even get to that, let's just note that, this Rashi is working off of a previous Rashi. What's the previous Rashi? The Gemara earlier on Chaf Aleph on Beis, famous Brisa, we've talked about other years, the Gemara says, "My Chanukah." What is Chanukah? Then the Gemara tells a story. Ton Rabbanan, right? B'chafei b'kislev yom b'dechanukah t'manya inun. There are 8 days of Chanukah, beginning on the 25th day of Kislev. You shouldn't have any eulogies. You not allowed to fast. And tells a story. The Greeks came into the Heichal, Timu kol hashmanim, kishegaver malchus beis chashmonai b'nitzchom. There was a military victory. Bodku v'lamatzu l'pach shel shemen. They only found one cruse of oil. She'emunach b'chasama shel kain gadol. V'lahoya ba lahadlan kel yom echad. It only could last one day. Nasa neis v'dliku shmona yamim. And then comes the punchline. L'shana acheres, the next year, kiva'um v'asa'um yamim tovim b'hala v'hodah. That's what Rashi, when Rashi says on Chav Daled Amud Aleph, that of course Tefillah has Al Anisim, because the Gemara says about it, right? Sharei lahalav v'hodah nikba'u. It's referring to this Gemara that says l'shana haba, the next year kiva'um v'asa'um yomim tovim b'halav v'hodah. That's, you could put it in quotation marks or put an asterisk. Look back on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. But you have to look further in the Rashi. So Rashi on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis explains what is Yom Tov B'Hala V'Hodah. So he explains on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, the Asamim Yom Tovim B'Hala V'Hodah, Lo Shasurim B'Malacha, is a famous Rashi. Rashi says, don't take, it sounds like there are 3 things that happen on Chanukah. Yom Tov, Halel, Hodah. Rashi says there aren't really 3, it's only 2. Why only 2? Because there's no Isur Malacha. So the Yom Tov is not a third component. It's not an independent component. It means this is a Yom Tov of Shelo Nikbu Ela Likros Halel Velomar Alanisim Behodah. Meaning, it's a Yom Tov with respect to 2 expressions. One is Hallel, and the other one is Hodah. And what does Hodah mean according to Rashi? Amiras al anisim. So now when you put the Rashi and Chaf Aleph Amud Beis with the Rashi and Chaf Daled Amud Aleph, you understand exactly what Rashi's saying. Rashi's saying, we said before that my Hanukkah, what's the definition of Hanukkah? What is Hanukkah? What's the essence of Hanukkah? The answer is it's a Yom Tov of Hallel and Hodah. What does Hodah mean? Al Anisim. So of course you have to say Al Anisim on Hanukkah. So when are you going to, if you're not saying it in Birchas, when are you going to say it? So let's say I told you that, you have that in order to be Koveya, Kiva'um va'asa'um, Hanukkah, right? That one of the methods or one of the manifestations of Hanukkah is through Hoda'ah. Hoda'ah is the saying of Al Anisim. Well, what is that likely to be in Tefillah or in Birchas Hamazon? If you had to presume it.
Tefillah.
Of course, Tefillah, because Tefillah is obligatory, right?
Right. Right. You don't have to eat it b'chlal. So if you don't have bread, you're not benching.
Right. We don't even know if, according to, and let me go a giant step further. The Maram Rutenberg in the tour, I'm just giving you the source for the tour, but it's much earlier, of course. This is the world of Ashkenaz Balei Tosas. They quote Rashi. What does Rashi say? That the word Yom Tov, don't be misled by Yom Tov. There aren't three things. It's a Yom Tov of Hallel and Hodah. And what is Hodah? Al Anisim. So then the Maram Rutenberg, commenting on that, says, and in my opinion, I'm just going to read you the line. I'm just quoting it from the tour out of convenience.
Purely spiritual day.
Exactly. So what he says is, you see from here that there is no physical joy obligation on Hanukkah. It's just Hallel and Hodah. 1 second, let me get the exact.
So the nest was a spiritual nest.
Yeah, exactly. 1 second. This is a line. My Hanukkah, he tells the Brisa, and then he quotes Rashi. And then he says, the Hoya Omer Haram mi Rutenberg, the Ram Rutenberg used to say, Sharibui Hasuda, Shamarbim Bahem, Hain Suudas Harishus. It was a practice people would have, Hanukkah parties or Hanukkah meals, right? We have that too. But you should know, says Maram Rutenberg, it's not a Sudas mitzvah per se. Later on, the poskim say, you have to have Divrei Torah. It's not enough to play dreidel at the Hanukkah Suda, according to the poskim. You have to have Divrei Torah.
And what happens if you don't have Divrei Torah? You're supposed to have Divrei Torah at every Suda. What happens if you don't?
Well, it's nice to have Divrei Torah at the Suda. But if you want to make it into a Sudas mitzvah, the point is it's not.
I'm going to make it a Sudas mitzvah
in its own right.
Without Divrei Torah.
Yeah, it's only a Sudas mitzvah if you say Divrei Torah. Shelo kavu ella lahalel lahodos velo lemishta v'simcha. That's the line of the Maram Rutenberg. So on this famous line, the Bach and the Lavush, right, 2 16th century, poskim, they both say something that became very famous, and that is they say, how come? The Bach says, why is it? Why on Purim do we have a Suda? And on Hanukkah, we don't. Well, you mentioned before that, the fact that there's a Suda is something unique. It's something it's one of the special manifestations. But what Bach and Lavush were troubled by is, okay, fine, we're not arguing the facts. We want to understand why the halacha chose to
emphasize the meal on Purim and not on Hanukkah. But first of all, Hanukkah is more complicated because it's 8 days. Purim's 1 day.
On Purim, it's a super meal, right? It's not even just a meal. It's a
right.
It's a Suda. It's it has special quality to it, and so on. So the Bach and the Bush both say, and each are in their own way for another time to discuss the differences, but the thrust of what they say is that, oh, you know what, in the case of Purim, this is famous, in the case of Purim, the threat was a physical threat. Lahashmid, Laharog, La'abed. Haman, through Achashverosh, wanted to physically annihilate, the Jewish people. And therefore, we observe, we commemorate, and we celebrate in a physical way as well. And therefore, we have a Suda. However, when it comes to Hanukkah, right, it was all about religious persecution, trying to deny them their, capacity, to serve the Rabbanu Shalom properly. Lashkicham Torasecha ulahaviram mechuke ritzonecha, meaning it was a cultural and a spiritual, religious, battle, but they weren't threatening per se. I mean, the Maccabim, the Hashmonaim, fought back, and they fought back in order to preserve their rights to religion, to religious freedom. So as a result, there was a war. But per se, right, the goal wasn't to physically annihilate Jewish people. It was to spiritually decimate their uniqueness. And therefore,
Right.
says the Levush on the Bach, that's the reason why, according to Maram Rutenberg's reading of Rashi, there is no Seuda on Hanukkah. And on Purim, there's a super Seuda. However,
Hanukkah should be more about, according to that logic, Hanukkah should be all about learning and doing the things that they try to block us from doing, right?
Yeah, 100%. Which is why even though tonight we are having a special Hanukkah shir, but there have been other years where, our Tuesday night shir, we just, keep moving forward. Or sometimes we do part and part, although I do admit that it doesn't always end up, 50-50. So, that's why, we implement these, Moadim, shiurim, in advance sometimes. But I always try to justify that by saying, well, the whole point of Hanukkah is,
but this is we're still learning. Rabbi, you're making it sound like we're not learning. We're still learning.
No. Right. No, I'm just saying that, there's in our base medrash, the it's a long time practice that that somebody puts up a sign in the kollel room where the kollel Avreichim are learning, a sign which quotes the Meiri in Masechet Shabbos, who says that it's like if your regular starim, cause you, to delay lighting Neros Hanukkah, don't worry about that. That's totally fine because
really,
yeah. So
that's interesting.
And that if for the reason that you're saying, because it's all about, so again, of course, it's are you singular things that you do?
Mitzvah patim and a mitzvah also.
Oh, okay, that too. But I think there's an additional element in particular about not disrupting the regular Sadar.
So, by the way, that
if you do so, you do so in a way that is
that contradicts all the yeshivas give off for Hanukkah, right? It should be reversed. They should have an in Shabbos of Hanukkah, and then should be off before or after.
You're right.
Because that's not what happens.
I don't know. Talmidim and the Rabbeim will appreciate your idea, but you're right.
No. Everything you're saying is Hanukkah should be about continuity in your schedule and learning, and not less learning.
Correct.
So
definitely not less learning.
But as we found out,
which is not reality.
As you say, if you have a shir on Yonei Hanukkah, that's fine too.
As we found out, it's very hard to change a minig.
That's also true.
Change what?
Okay. Anyway, so obviously, especially if you take the view of the Maram Rutenberg and so on, that there is no din of Seuda per se on Chanukah. So the idea that the Alanisim and Birchas Hamazon becomes even more puzzling. How it escalated from you don't have to do it to, you can if you want to, you should do it to, in some rarer circles, if you don't do it, you have to repeat, the Birchas Hamazon. However, on the other side of it, just to be clear, the Rambam perhaps this is a certain irony too. The Rambam may be an advocate for Seuda on Hanukkah. Why do I say that? So the Gemara that we read on Chafalef Amud Beis says that, Kivaum va'asaum Yom Tov, B'Halel v'Hoda. So we know what Rashi's interpretation is. We just said it. Rashi says the word Yom Tov is Lav Dafka, right? And the word Hoda is Alanis. The Rambam, however, in Perek Gimel, Hilchos Chanukah Halacha Gimel, when he repeats that brisa, and you can tell if you look at the Rambam carefully, I'll read it to you very quickly, you can tell it's a perush on the brisa of the Gemara, as we've said many times. The Rambam, of course, is known as, as the great posek. But to be the great posek, he first had to be the great parshan of the Talmud, meaning he had his own reading, which he invested, tremendous effort, into trying to read the Shas as accurately as possible. So there, we spend so much time on Rambams because we're trying to figure out how he read the Gemara, how he understood the concepts. So here's another example. So in Perek Gimel, Hilchos Chanukah Halacha Gimel, and just remember, it's so misleading. The Rambam put Hilchos Megillah and Chanukah together. So Hilchos Chanukah really begins in Perek Gimel. The first two prakim are Hilchos Megillah, and Perek Gimel is Gimel and Dalid is Hilchos Chanukah. So it's really the first parak of Hilchos Chanukah. So in Halacha, he starts off in Halacha Aleph by telling the story, the background of what the challenges were during that historical era. And then he gets to the Brisa, my Chanukah, and the Yavanim and what they did in the war. And then he says, Mipnei zed, Kinu Chakamim Shebo Sodor, Shiyu Shmona Yamim Ha'elu. That's exactly what the Brisa is saying. That's exactly in the Brisa, right? Starts on the 25th day. And what is it? My Chanukah, what is it? So again, remember, in the Gemara, it's Yom Tov, Halel, Hoda. This is the language of the Rambam. Yemei Simcha, the Halel, Umadlikin Bahaneros, Ba'erev, Al Piske Habatim, B'chalayla V'layla, Mishmonas Halelos, Laharus, Legalos, Asanes. That's a big sense. So how come the Rambam is basically reading the Brisa of the Gemara? That's exactly what he's doing, except that he switched two terms. There were three terms in the Gemara: Yom Tov, Halel, Hoda. The only one that's intact is Halel. For Yom Tov, the Rambam translated Yom Tov into Simcha. And instead of Hoda, after Halal, he says, right, Umadlikin bahen haneros be'erev al piskei abatim b'chalayla v'leila mishmonas halaylos laharis u'legalos esanes, which leads some of the Mefarshim to, even some of the earlier Mefarshim, to conclude that the Rambam understood that the word, everybody's troubled in that brisa, like what happened to Neiros Chanukah. Some of them Farshim in, I think the Ramah, Darkei Moshe, I think quotes it, say, it says Asaum ukivaum. So maybe the Asaum is let me see if I can find it. The Asaum is Neiros Chanukah. And the Kivaum is the Halel, and the Hodah, because they're I'm sorry, the Bach quotes it. Kosav Haraim, Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, right? Lefi Girsa Zu Kivaum Koya Hadlaka de La'el, Va'asaum Koya Hal V'Hodah. Aval Esram Shela Kosav Ela Kivaum Levad Kasha Mimasha Lehuskar Gamad Laka Shehu Ikar. A lot of the Farshim were troubled. They say, my Chanukah, and this is what they did, not mention the Neiros Chanukah at all. So his answer is, if you have the Girsa, Kivaum v'Asaum, so this is the Kivaum and the Asaum is the Neros Chanukah. But the Rambam has a different answer. The Rambam's answer is that the word Hodah is encapsulated by the mitzvah of Neros Chanukah. And then later on in Perek Daled, Halacha Yud Beis, the Rambam says very clearly, he says that mitzvah Neros Chanukah Chaviva Hi Ad Ma'od, that the mitzvah of Chanukah is very endearing, very precious. And then he goes on to say that it reflects the Nes, and it's a source of Hodaya, which is Hodah, right? So this is what he says. Thanksgiving on Nisim Sha'asalon. So the Rambam's parshanut of the Gemara is that the word Yom Tov, unlike Rashi who says Yom Tov doesn't mean anything, Yom Tov means it's a Yom Tov of, right? But it's not a third factor. The Rambam says, yes, it is. It's Simcha. As for Hallel, Hallel is, they both agree about that. But Hodah, which means Al Anisim to the, to Rashi, it means Hadlakas Neros to the Rambam. What happened to Al Anisim for the Rambam? The answer is Al Anisim was banished to Hilchos Tefillah. Banished is a strong word, but he doesn't mention it in the entire Hilchos Chanukah. If you look at the Tur in the Shulchan Aruch, they speak, as we just discussed, Siman Taf Reish Pei Beis, which I was reading from before, is all about Al Anisim. The Rambam doesn't have a Hilchos Al Anisim in Hilchos Chanukah. He just mentions it as a Haskara in Tefillah and Berachos Hamazon.
Isn't it part of Hodor?
What?
Isn't it part of Hodor?
No, that's what I'm trying to say. For Rashi, it's part of Hodah, but not for the Rambam.
But the Rambam may take it as obvious that Hodor.
Well, if it's obvious, then it should have been part of Hilchos. He should have mentioned it in Hilchos Chanukah, right? I mean, the only time in all of Mishnah Torah that Rambam speaks about Al Anisim is when he talks about Tefillah and Berachos Hamazon, in Hilchos Tefillah, in other words, not at all in Hilchos Chanukah. If it was a pivotal, for Rashi, it's pivotal. For the Rambam, it seems to be, I would say, trivial, but it's not a major factor. But on the other hand, there's the irony. On the other hand, the Rambam says that Yom Tov means Simcha. So the Bach and the Marshal, I should say the Marshal and the Bach and others say, oh, the Rambam disagrees with the Maram Rutenberg. He thinks that there's a Suda.
Well, why do we have to say that? Simcha could mean no Avelis, no Haspedim, no.
Right, but that you already have in Megillus Tainus. It's part of Megillah. We already said that. I mean, the Brisa of My Chanukah begins by saying, "De lo lemisped v'hom v'lo de hisanu b'hom." That's true of every Megillus Tainus. And then it goes on, here, I'll read the language of the Gemara again, just to make it clear, because your question is a good question. And actually, the Grizz, or Velvel, says something like that a little bit. My Chanukah, de Toner Rabbanan b'chafei b'kislev yom de Chanukah t'manyon inu de lo lemisped b'hon v'lo lihisanos b'hon. So that we've said already. You don't need to say Asamim Yomim Tovim equals Simcha for that. You said it already. So it comes, but this is what the Bach says. The Bach says, after this is very interesting because, again, it's interesting how certain statements that great people make are just, they have a life of their own. So the Bach in Hilchos Chanukah, together with the Levush, are very well known for the distinction that they make between Purim and Chanukah, like we said before. One was a spiritual crisis, the other was a physical, threat, etc. But the Bach himself ends up rejecting it. No one knows this part. I mean, they know it, or maybe they don't. But this is him. By Omer Maram, Ikalameda ki gufa kasha lama lo kivaum lemishta lesimcha kamo bepurim. Like, why does Purim have the Suda and not? So that's what he gives his answer. Purim ikra gzera haisa shenenu misudasa shalosa rashal ke nigzar leim la rogola abed sagufim, etc. But when he finishes with all of that, right, He then goes on to say, Ula inyan halacha, this is the Bach talking, Nirolanias daiti de lo kemaram. He says, oh, by the way, that's the right shot in the Maram Wittenberg, in Ashkenaz. But he says, but I think we don't paskin that way. The minag zeh shamar bin b'seuda kvar nogu bo gedolei hador kadmonim. He said it's an old tradition that we have big festive meals on Hanukkah. Umarshal Kosav Kain to Rambam Mashmadime Simchahain. That's how the Marshal read the Rambam. The Kain Kosav Mordechai Ha'aruch. Ba'ain Rambam Per Gimel Halacha Gimel. The Zelashon Marash Me Österreich. The Austria. The Bechanaka Yesh Linog Simcha U Mishta. The Kain Bucha Ktsas Barambam. V'yesh mivim rayim perik beis the Shabbos b'Mordechai. V'ochiach ktsas, this is the Bach, me Rabbeinu Yoel, meaning the Raviyah, quotes this Rabbeinu Yoel, his father-in-law, shepasak b'birchas hamazon and loar malanisim makzirin oso, shmamino deshayni mishara yamim below sogi below pas.
Shouldn't we start with the thought process that only Chagim D'Oraisa should have an obligation of a Mishnah?
Oh, well, I mean, Purim.
And that's why in Purim they had to say, Mordechai and Esther had to decree, no, you have to have a Mishnah, because basically if it's not a D'Oraisa, there should not be an obligation for Mishnah.
Could be. I mean, again, remember that the Gemara's Safek Abal in Birchas Hamazon in general is because it's only Drabanan. But I would say, even without that. But the point I'm trying to make is there's a certain irony here, right? The irony is that Rashi, who promotes Al-Anisim as being very central, probably, according to the Ram Rittenberg at least, based on the way he read the words, Halav V'Hodah and Yom Tov, probably doesn't think there's a Chi of Suda and Chanukah. And yet Al-Anisim, is very central. The Rambam, who according to the Marshal and Bach and others, not everybody agrees because he doesn't say the word Suda, but he does say the word Simcha. Simcha is definitely often associated with Suda. So the Rambam believes there's a Suda, right? But it's hard to believe that he gives so much prominence to Al-Anisim since he never mentioned it in Hilchos Chanukah. So there's a kind of a catch-22 here. But I'd like to say our two things, because our time is moving, a little bit late. So let me say two things. Number one, the Balei Tosfos ask an interesting question here. On the Gemara Chav Daled Amud Aleph, when the Gemara raises this question, should you insert Al-Anisim into Birchos Hamazon on Chanukah? So Tosfos asks a question that, is a little bit rare for Balei Tosfos, a location question. Right? Tosfos says, I'm going to read it. 1 second. Here it is. Iboilu ma'u lahasker shel Chanukah b'Birchos Hamazon. Tosfos says, Tema. Dehach milsa havelei lasuka la'el gabi mili de Chanukah. All of a sudden, Tosfos says, listen, the main topics of Hanukkah were dealt with in the Dapim, starting on Chaf Aleph, Chaf Beis, a little Chaf Gimel. By the time you get to Chaf Daled already, right, they're not really dealing with Hanukkah anymore. They're dealing with kind of other issues. For example, the next Gemara wonders whether or not, you should Iboilu ma'u lahasker Rosh Chodesh b'Birchos Hamazon. Right? Imtim Salomra b'Chanukah d'Rabbanan lo tzarich, Rosh Chodesh d'Oraisa tzarich, Odil Makivin l'Aser Batzias Malacha lo maz Karina. So they're more dealing and once you get to Daf Chav Daled, they're dealing with like broader issues of Haskaros, Ritzei, Alav Yavo, Rosh Chodesh, Yom Tov. Should you mention Al-Anisim, for example, in the Musaf of do you say it in the Musaf of Hanukkah, right? Rosh Chodesh. right? It's Rosh to today and tomorrow, right? Yeah, and this morning and tomorrow morning. You say Musaf. Why are we saying Musaf? Not for Hanukkah, but for Rosh Chodesh. But do you still say Al Anisim? Even though the reason for that tefillah is not because of Hanukkah? So we do. But that's what the Gemara is discussing on Chavdal Ramadal. So the Bali Tosas ask, if there's a question whether or not you say Al Anisim in the Birchas Hamazon of Hanukkah, shouldn't that question have been like 3 dapim earlier when they're really talking about an Yoni Hanukkah per se, not this more objective question about Haskaros? And he doesn't answer the question. However, what I think one could say, and this is a little bit, again, you don't have it in front of you, so there's no point in my reading it, but there's an interesting tshuva of the Avnei Nezer. Avnei Nezer and Simon Tuf in Orchayin, Tuf Kuf. I'm sorry, Tuf Reish. No, I'm sorry, Tuf Kuf Zion. That's what it is. So he discusses the question of the relationship between Al Anisim and Tefillah and in Birchas Hamazon. So he's troubled. He says, like, why is it? Why did the Gemara assume that there's Al Anisim definitely in Tefillah, even if there isn't in Birchas Hamazon? Like, what's the difference? So he wants to suggest the following idea. He doesn't say it exactly this way. I'm pulling it out of there because I was also looking for it because of the Tosas. And that is as follows. He says, basically, you could say Al Anisim for 2 different reasons. You could say Al Anisim because it's Hanukkah, and therefore we're looking for vehicles, we're looking for frameworks in which to be Mafar Shem the Nes, right? Just like we light the candles, that's Pirsum Anes. So we're also looking to be Mafar Shem the Nes, through, Haskaros, through davening or benching. So the reason that you would be saying, let's say, Al Anisim, B'mei Matas Yom, Ben Yochanan, Chashmonayu, Banav, etc., is as part of Persumei Nisa, the Mechayev, it's part of the Hanukkah obligation. Or, he says, maybe just since it is Hanukkah and you're davening, you're saying tefillah, or you're saying Birchas Hamazon, maybe it's just a me'ena ma'ora, meaning if you're already benching on this day, you can't leave it out, because to leave it out would be a benching problem or a Shmoneh Esrei problem. Everybody with me? In other words, the question, what he says is, there are 2 reasons you might say Al Anisim. One is because of Hilchos Chanukah, because it's another opportunity to trumpet the Ribono Shel Olam special hashgacha. Or it might be that the requirements of Tefillah and Birchas Hamazon themselves demand, that you can't ignore.
Askaros Hayom, you mean?
Me'ena ma'ora, Haskaras Hayom. Because if you don't, then you're like losing an opportunity, right, to emphasize something that is crucial to the Tefillah and to the Birchas Hamazon.
Misrepresented the day.
Yeah, or misrepresent the opportunity to emphasize Birchas Hamazon and Shmoneh Esrei. So the Avnei Nezer says that's maybe what Rashi meant when he said, "Oh, the Gemara in Chaf Aleph Amud Beis says my Chanukah," right? And there the Gemara says it's a day of Hallel and Hodah. So of course that's going to express itself in Tefillah. I'm adding, meaning it's not going to be Birchas Hamazon, especially if there's no obligation to eat bread. That's not going to be the way that you proactively are mefarsem the nes of Chanukah, right? So the only way you would do that, because of the role that Shmoneh Esrei plays generally, and also because it's a constant, it's a 3 times a day, framework, of course it has to refer to the tefillah. You could say even more, because of its prominence, it's part of the kviyos. There's, for example, just to highlight it even further, a Rosh Chodesh Shemusa for a tefillah of Shabbos and Yom Tov, as opposed to, is different than a tefillah of kol, not just the hazkara, the whole thing. It's not so true in Birchas Hamazon. Birchas Hamazon, it's hazkara, more like, let's say a chol hamoed, kind of a thing. So what the Avnei Nezer says, the Gemara knew that the only obligation of Pirsumei Nisan Chanukah would be in tefillah, not in Birchas Hamazon. Again, he doesn't give all these explanations. He says like one line. I'm building it from there. However, what the Gemara was wondering was maybe from a Birchas Hamazon, if you're already benching on Chanukah, not to take the opportunity, to integrate Al Anisim is a deficient Birchas Hamazon in this context. So he doesn't say this either. I'm saying a lot more than what I'm picking up from signals from him, but I'm expanding it, and I don't want. I'm partially taking credit, but I also am taking blame if it's wrong. So this is my answer to Tosas's question, right? Tosas asked the question. All of a sudden, the Gemara in Chav Daled Amud Aleph is asking this question. It would have been made more sense if they asked it in the middle of the Chanukah sugyas on Chav Aleph and Chav Beis and Chav Gimel. This is a different context already. Why are they asking this question now? The answer is, in my opinion, because it's a different question. The Al Anisim of Tefillah, right, that which is mentioned on Chav Aleph Amud Beis according to Rashi, that the Mechayev, that's a Hilchos Chanukah halacha, right? What the Gemara wants to know on Chav Daled Amud Aleph is a Birchas Hamazon halacha. To say it, just to make it even clearer, as I mentioned before, for the Rambam, all of Al Anisim is a tefillah and a Birchas Hamazon halacha. It's not the method of Pirsumei Nisav, which derives or which stems from the obligation of Chanukah. It says like it would be criminal is a harsh word. It would be, irresponsible, to omit the example of Chanukah from the Hoda'ah of Tefillah or Birchas Hamazon. You have ready examples that can highlight, those themes. So to ignore that is wrong, and therefore it's a din in Hilchos Birchas Hamazon, it's a din in Hilchos Tefillah. But according to the Gemara and according to Rashi, maybe that's exactly the difference between Tefillah and Birchas Hamazon. But let me go a step further. So we said before, Jacob, you're still here. Oops, I shouldn't say that ever. Okay. Jacob mentioned before.
Yes, I was on mute. I'm still here. I'm not leaving.
Okay, great.
I'm here.
So remember your suggestion before? You want to revolutionize the yeshivas? You want to start a revolution, right? No.
Yeah, so I'm looking for more enemies. So I want to make yeshiva stay.
I'm with you. It's not in my yeshiva, but in other yeshivas. I think it's a good idea. So
Kollel shouldn't be off. You know what I'm saying?
Should not be off.
Cancel Shabbos Chanukah.
Exactly. So what's the idea behind it? So I that came from what I was saying about the Meiri and what the real struggle was. So in a way, we're talking about two perspectives now about Al Anisim. One, Al Anisim as a method of Hirsum, like you light the candles. That's one way to do it. You tell the story. That's another way to spread the story of Hanukkah, right? But now we're talking about a different dimension, and that is, it's not, the Mechayev isn't Hanukkah. The Mechayev is Hodah of Tefillah and Hodah of Birchas Hamazon, right? And what we're saying is that Hanukkah is about all year round. Hanukkah is about accentuating, right, something, which isn't just about 8 days, right? The hashgacha that was visited upon Klal Yisrael on Hanukkah, which is why, by the way, unlike other Megillas Tainus, the Purim and Hanukkah are enduring themes, right? They outlasted Megillus Tainus. Right? The Yerushalmi says that, and the Rambam codifies this as the last halacha in Hilchos Megillah, that even in the future, even if the rest of the Svarim of Nach will not, have that status anymore, but the Megillah is different. The Megillah Lo Yasuf, it'll never go away, as enduring, impact. So the Gaonim say also that you have to be respectful how you burn off the shemen of Hanukkah even after Hanukkah, because it has enduring impact. So the point is that when we talk about Al Anisim as an expression of Birchas Hamazon or of Hodah of Modim, in a way they're more powerful, not as methods or vehicles of Pirsum Hanes that issue from Hanukkah, but as such acute, can't miss, examples of the stable frameworks that apply every single day, right? For the same reasons that we were talking about, before. So in a way, this is exactly what happened in the Gemara, meaning the Gemara starts off and says, is there an obligation to say Al Anisim in Hanukkah? And according to Bali Tosas, the Gemara is asking this question on Daf Chav Daled Amud Aleph, not on Chav Aleph, meaning is from the perspective of Hanukkah, Birchas Hamazon maybe is not an obligation of Al Anisim. But in terms of Birchas Hamazon's own integrity on Hanukkah, shouldn't you have to mention Al Anisim? So the Gemara says, well, maybe it's only Drabanan, you don't really have to. Per se, you don't have to. Then the Gemara says, however, very fascinating phenomenon, imba, meaning you could if you want. What do you mean you could if you want? You can insert like new paragraphs in the middle of Birchas Hamazon if you feel like it. The answer is no, but everybody understands that this isn't new paragraph. This is a, manifestation of what Noda Lecha, of what, Moda Manachnu Lach and Tefillah is all about. So it's an excellent historical paradigm. That's not a hefsek. That's what the Gemara says. Oh, you'd put it in Modin. Then the Gemara says, Rava thought maybe you should treat it like Meida Ma'ora, like Ritzei or something like that, right? So then the Gemara says, no. Just like in Tefillah, you should put it in Modin. So from there, even the mainstream poskim drop the imba, if he wants to do it, and all of a sudden it became you're supposed to say Al Anisim in Birchas Hamazon. And then the Rav Yo went a giant step further, and he said, actually, Kivan de Kiblu Shavya Kachova. So like we said before, it isn't minhag, it's more than minhag. The example he's giving at Tefillas Harvest, for sure, Klal Yisrael have a certain power sometimes. So, but in this case, it's even more understandable, because basically what we're saying is the more there's an expectation that you wouldn't just gloss over and overlook this incredible example, that you're living through during these 8 days, right? Once, the expectation is to say it, so not to say it is almost like, a lost opportunity, like an undermining of, like you're saying, the words of Hoda'ah in Birchas Hamazon, but you're in the middle, of the days of Hanukkah, and you're not going to exemplify it and deepen it, and both your appreciation and an example of the Rebbeinu Shalom's hashgacha, right? Kivan de Kiblu Shavya Kechova. That's really what it is. So we don't go that far lahalach. Fine. But what we do think is that it's no longer voluntary, that you're supposed to say it. And what's fascinating is that Rabbeinu Tam, even though you're not choser, in the sense that if you finish benching or you're not going to repeat the benching or repeat the Shemon Esrei, but Rabbeinu Tam did think that you would go back within Shemon Esrei and maybe within Birchas Hamazon, right, to the previous section if you omitted it. So the other poskim said, why? Why would he think that? It's just not ma'akev. But just like the Rabbi, had this kind of penchant for thinking that it really should be ma'akev once there's an expectation for it. So Rabbeinu Tam is saying, maybe it's only drabanan. There is no chiyuv in the case of benching. Let's say in the case of Shemon Esrei, there's a chiyuv, but so it's not enough to be choser. However, right, just a little less than that, right? It's significant to express that, and I think the reason is because this is what Hodah really is. Hodah, by definition, is a maximalist expression. There's, if a person really feels thanksgiving or a sense of gratitude for divine providence, there are no halfways in that. So, the inability to express it when it's staring you right in the face is a particular problem, right? It really undercuts, the sincerity, or at least the, how reflective you are, about what Hodah really is. And in that respect, maybe Birchas Hamazon, even though it starts off as less, especially as kind of pursuing Nisa, but it ends up as more because the quintessential Birchas Hodah as a in totality is Birchas Hamazon, right? That's what it is. V'chalta v'savata. It's a bracha about hashgacha and parnasa, and the appreciation for the things that most people take for granted, to attribute that to the Rabbanu Shalom. So maybe Dafka Birchas Hamazon, once there was this awareness or consciousness or expectation, that Al Anisim would accompany it, that compensates, let's say, for the fact that on a Pirsum level, especially if there's no Chi of Suda, right? And even if there is, you can't compare, the Pirsum. For example, the Balei Tosas on the same daf, when they want to explain why is Tefillah better than Birchas Hamazon, which is implied in the Gemara, they give another explanation, and that is, that Tefillah is Chazar Sashatz. Everybody's standing together as a tzibur, and then there's Chazar Sashatz, right? You don't necessarily have that in benching. Sometimes you're benching, you're eating alone, right? Or even if you're not, eating alone, you're not necessarily saying every word out loud, right? So on a Pirsum level, as a mechayev of Chanukah to tell the story, you can't compare Tefillah and Birchas Hamazon. But as an expression of Hashgacha and Hodah, beyond the event, but as an exemplification of the broader concept, actually Birchas Hamazon, in some respects, is at least equally appropriate, and that's already a chiddush, and in some cases even more appropriate than Shemon Esrei. Okay, so just to sum up, we have a curious Gemara. The Gemara raises the question about whether or not you say Al Anisim in Birchas Hamazon or not. The Gemara seems to assume that you definitely say it in Tefillah. That in itself is very intriguing. Like, how do they know that? That's A. B, the Gemara then seems to, answer no, and then a second later talk about, kind of a practice of Klal Yisrael wanting or just, inserting it anyway. And then, as we noted, in the in the evolution of this issue, mostly in the halacha, it's treated the equivalent of tefillah, even though it doesn't sound that way, from the Gemara. It sounds like imba lahaskir, almost created an equal status. And then, as we noted, according to the Rabbi, even more so, you're actually choser if you omit it. And he invokes Klal Yisrael's, embrace of this opportunity, catapulted it, to something, that was no longer voluntary, but was not only obligatory, but is ma'akev. That's a very fascinating phenomenon. Even if you don't accept that the halacha, it needs to be explained. Then we noted several reasons why Shemon Esrei would be superior. Then we noted that there's a debate whether there's a chiyuv suda on Hanukkah or not, all going back to Rashi and the Rambam's interpretation of the Brisa of my Hanukkah, and that the irony is that for Rashi there's no suda, and for the Rambam there's less emphasis on al anisim. But then finally, what we're trying to explain is that there are two dimensions to saying al anisim in Tefillah and Birchas Hamazon. One is the Hanukkah part, the added opportunity of Pirsum Hanes, just like you light, so too you articulate in the context of Tefillah Birchas Hamazon. Then there's another aspect, and that is the extent to which this manifestation of Hodah, integrates into and shouldn't be squandered as an opportunity, to highlight these themes in Tefillah and in Birchas Hamazon. And maybe that's why the Gemara deals with it on Chav Daled and not on Chav Aleph. And maybe that's the distinction between Tefillah and Birchas Hamazon. Maybe for the Rambam, you only have that second din, both for Tefillah and Birchas Hamazon. Maybe that's why he omits it from Hilchos Hanukkah. But maybe that's also why this took on greater or assumed greater importance, and especially in Birchas Hamazon, as the quintessential, Birchas Hoda'ah, but again, especially with the expectation, that it be there, that, it kind of undermines what Birchas Hamazon is supposed to be broadly, when you ignore that. But either way, even the quality between Birchas Hamazon and Tefillah is something that is very striking. And of course, the takeaway from all this is the impact, enduring impact that Hanukkah has on the rest of the year and on the institutions of the year. Again, of course, like any moed, it's a mikra, the Doraisa mikra kodeshes are like this as well. And that is their singular parts, things that we accentuate, the opportunity to zero in on something very specific and very different, on a particular day or days of the year. But at the same time, these things belong to the rest of the year. I've spoken a lot about that, when it comes to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, especially, but for sure also Pesach and Shavuos. So the Chagim D'Rabbanan also have this enduring quality that they kind of transform, or at least they provide like a perspective on our daily frameworks to make us appreciate these themes and therefore those frameworks in a more ambitious or aspirational way as well. So I wish everybody Hanukkah Sameach. Again, we still have
the most important day is the 8th day.
What?
Isn't the 8th day is a big day, right? For davening and stuff.
Zos Hanukkah, yeah, 100%. So we have the second day Rosh Chodesh, which is now, and then we have the final day. In the world of Chassidus,
right,
in the world of Chassidus, which I'm not going to speak about, but the merging of Kislev and Teves is also a very interesting, theme.
I've heard that.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
the davening is during the lighting, it has a certain power, but that's Chassidus. During the lighting, that has a power during the time of the lighting specifically. Or
what do you mean a power?
For davening, after you light, that time is no okay. I
mean, it's from my point of view. There's plenty to focus on, just in the themes themselves. But it could be.
Rabbi, may I ask something?
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Have a happy Hanukkah. Thank you,
Rabbi.
Yeah, sure.
Rabbi, may I ask something? Since
Sure.
Nobody else is here. Yeah. No, Al Ha'anasim. Does it have anything to
Hanisim.
do with, yeah, does it have anything to do with Eretz Yisrael? Because the gematria of Al Hanasim with a final mem is 600 plus the 7 letters comes out to be 832, which is Eretz Yisrael. Now, if we just have the Vav with the Al Hanasim, it becomes 831, which is Aleph itself. So again, this is for me, when I see this, my question is, I want to keep it, legitimate for you. I don't want to get, but do they ever bring down that Al Ha-Nasim has anything to do with
Israel? You know what?
Yeah.
I'm not. I would. There's a sefer called the Bnei Yissaschar. The right name, which is a Hasidic work. I actually have it here in front of me. I've been looking at it out of curiosity. It's called the Bnei Yissaschar. He has many gematrias like the one that you just meant. I don't remember if he has that one specifically, but
right
it wouldn't
in the
surprise
prayer.
me. He
May
works
I
with
see? May I
gematrias.
see that? May I see the Hebrew of that? Because I can't understand. I didn't hear. I don't. No, the Hebrew. Yeah. Yisaka. Okay. Yeah, I'll see.
Well,
I got it.
I don't remember if he has this one, but he has
Yeah, I understand.
many
I
gematrias
understand.
like that. And let's remember that unlike Purim, which took place in diaspora, right? The story of Hanukkah is
Right.
very much a story about life in Eretz Yisrael. So
I don't know. Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So historically, the connection of Hanukkah to Eretz Yisrael, of course, is a very major theme. So
Thank
you
you.
might be onto something.
Well, I'll look. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay. Have a great
Happy Hanukkah.
rest of the Hanukkah.
Thank you.